A black veteran named Jeremiah had just stepped off the bus after years of serving his country overseas. He was finally home, ready to rebuild his life and reconnect with the community he had fought to protect. But within minutes of arriving at the station, everything unraveled. A security guard accused him of loitering and refusing to move, escalating the situation without cause. The humiliation was swift and public. Stripped of his dignity, he was escorted out as bystanders whispered and avoided eye contact. 7 minutes later, a local officer approached Jeremiah outside the station, claiming he was trespassing. The accusations spiraled into an arrest. What happened next shocked the entire town and sparked a movement no one expected. This is a story of injustice, resilience, and the fight for redemption that you won't forget. Stay with me because this story will open your eyes to the struggles hidden in plain sight. Before we dive in, comment below and tell us where you're watching from today. And if you find Jeremiah's journey inspiring, don't forget to follow along for more. It all started on what should have been just an ordinary day. The morning light spilled over the narrow streets of Willow Grove, a small southern town seemingly suspended in time. Its red brick buildings, whitewashed picket fences, and well-manicured lawns whispered of history, though not the kind written in books. Beneath the surface of its charm lay a tension as old as the cobblestones, a weight that even the sun could not lift. This was the place Jeremiah Givens called home, though home was a word he used carefully. Jeremiah, a soft-spoken man of 42, walked down Main Street toward the diner where he worked as a cook. His leather-bound notebook, a constant companion, peeked out from his jacket pocket, a testament to his dreams of writing, dreams that, like so many others, had been deferred but never fully extinguished. As he passed the courthouse, he couldn't help but glance at its towering columns, a symbol of justice that always seemed just out of reach for people like him. Jeremiah adjusted his cap and quickened his pace, hoping to reach the diner before the states became too heavy. Inside the diner, the morning rush was in full swing. The clinking of plates and hum of conversation filled the air. At the counter, a group of regulars, mostly older white men, discussed local politics. Jeremiah busied himself in the kitchen, flipping pancakes and scrambling eggs, the rhythm of his work shielding him from the conversations that always seemed to circle back to topics that left a sour taste in his mouth. "Jeremiah," called out Elsie, the waitress, poking her head into the kitchen. "Mr. Granger's complaining about his coffee again. I want it hotter." Jeremiah sighed but grabbed the pot anyway. Mr. Granger, a retired banker with a sharp tongue, was a man who seemed to take pleasure in finding faults. Jeremiah approached the table cautiously. "This coffee's lukewarm," Mr. Granger said without looking up. "You people can't seem to get anything right." The words hung in the air, cutting through the clatter of the diner. Jeremiah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, setting the fresh cup down with a steady hand. He returned to the kitchen, his mind swirling. Moments like these were a quiet storm, building and receding, leaving behind invisible scars. After his shift, Jeremiah made his way to the park, seeking solace beneath the old oak tree near the river. He pulled out his notebook, letting the sound of rustling leaves guide his pen. His words poured out like a confession, capturing the ache of a man caught between his own potential and the barriers the world had placed before him. He was so absorbed in his writing that he didn't notice Mrs. Harris, the librarian, approach. "Jeremiah," she said softly, startling him, "I've been meaning to talk to you." Mrs. Harris, a white woman in her 60s, was one of the few people in Willow Grove who treated Jeremiah with consistent kindness. She handed him a worn envelope. "This came to the library addressed to you. I thought you might want it right away." Jeremiah took the envelope, his heart racing as he read the return address, the Southern Writers Collective. Weeks ago, he had submitted an essay to a regional competition on a whim, pouring his frustrations and hopes into the piece. He had almost forgotten about it. "Open it," Mrs. Harris urged, her smile encouraging. Jeremiah hesitated but finally tore it open. The words, "Congratulations," leapt off the page. He had won third place and an invitation to speak at a local event. His chest swelled with a mixture of pride and disbelief. "That's wonderful," Mrs. Harris exclaimed. "You deserve this, Jeremiah." But even as he thanked her, doubt crept in. He could already hear the whispers. What's a man like him doing in a place like that? Willow Grove was a small town, but its boundaries, both physical and social, were firmly entrenched. As Jeremiah walked home that evening, the envelope clutched in his hand, he passed the courthouse again. The setting sun cast long shadows across its facade, making it appear both grand and foreboding. He knew this invitation was more than an opportunity, it was a test. One that would force him to navigate the quiet but persistent barriers that shaped every aspect of his life. For the first time in years, Jeremiah allowed himself to imagine standing behind a podium, his words resonating beyond the confines of Willow Grove. But the path to that moment would not be easy. The weight of expectation, judgment, and unseen forces loomed large. And so, as he reached his small, weathered house at the edge of town, Jeremiah resolved to face whatever lay ahead. The battle would be quiet, but it would be his. The day after receiving the letter, Jeremiah walked down Willow Grove's narrow streets with a sense of purpose that felt foreign to him. He clutched the envelope in his hand, its weight both exhilarating and daunting. The Southern Writers Collective event was less than 2 weeks away, and while his heart pulsed with the thrill of recognition, doubt trailed close behind. As he neared the library, Jeremiah noticed a group of young boys on bicycles darting across the street, their laughter echoing in the still morning air. He couldn't help but smile, a fleeting reminder of simpler times before the world began pressing its invisible hand against his chest. The library was quiet, as usual. Mrs. Harris greeted him warmly, motioning for him to join her at one of the study tables. She had taken a special interest in Jeremiah's writing over the years, offering books and encouragement whenever she could. Today, however, her enthusiasm seemed tempered by concern. "Jeremiah," she began, sliding a neatly typed program across the table. His name was listed among a dozen others, each representing writers from across the South. "This is a big deal. But, you know this won't be easy." Jeremiah nodded, understanding the subtext in her words. The collective's event would be held in Greenville, a city larger than Willow Grove but carrying the same undercurrents of division. It was one thing to win a prize, it was another to stand before an audience that might question not only his words but his right to speak them. That afternoon, Jeremiah returned to the diner, where Elsie was wiping down the counters. "You've got that look," she said, raising an eyebrow. "What look?" Jeremiah replied, sliding onto a stool. "The one that says you're carrying something heavy," she said, planting a hand on her hip. "Spill it." Jeremiah hesitated but eventually shared the news. Elsie's face lit up at first, but her smile quickly faded. "Greenville, huh?" she said, leaning in closer. "You know how folks can be." "I know," Jeremiah said quietly, "but I've got to try." Before Elsie could respond, the bell above the diner's door jingled, and in walked Mr. Granger with his usual air of entitlement. He glanced at Jeremiah, his lip curling slightly before turning to Elsie. "Coffee. Black," he barked. Jeremiah felt the familiar sting of being dismissed. But this time, it barely registered. His focus was on the notebook in his jacket pocket, the speech he had been drafting during every stolen moment. A week later, Jeremiah stood in front of the cracked mirror in his bedroom, adjusting the tie Mrs. Harris had lent him. The event was the next morning, and he would be boarding the bus to Greenville at dawn. He had worked tirelessly on his speech, pouring his heart into each word. But the closer the moment came, the more his resolve wavered. The phone rang, its sharp sound breaking the silence. It was Henry Dawson, a childhood friend who had moved to Greenville years ago. "Heard you're coming to my neck of the woods," Henry said. His tone was light, but there was an edge to it. "Are you ready for what's waiting?" "I'm ready as I'll ever be," Jeremiah replied, though his voice lacked conviction. "Well, if you need a friendly face, I'll be there," Henry said, "but don't expect it to be easy. Folks here aren't any different than back home. Maybe worse." After they hung up, Jeremiah sat on the edge of his bed, his fingers tracing the edges of his notebook. The reality of what he was stepping into began to crystallize. Greenville wasn't just a town. It was a test of everything he believed about himself and the world. The next morning, Jeremiah boarded the bus. The ride was long, and the conversations around him carried the faint drawl of the South. He sat by the window, the landscape rolling past like a series of unspoken memories. Fields gave way to small towns, and small towns gave way to the bustling streets of Greenville. As he stepped off the bus, the air felt heavier. Henry was waiting, his tall frame leaning against a weathered truck. "Welcome to the city," he said with a grin. though his eyes scanned the crowd as if searching for trouble. Henry drove Jeremiah to the event venue, a grand old building in the heart of downtown. As they pulled up, Jeremiah noticed a group of people gathered outside. Some held programs and wore polite smiles, but others stood with folded arms, their expressions unreadable. "Looks like you've got a mixed crowd," Henry said, his voice low. Jeremiah nodded, clutching his notebook tighter. Inside, the room was buzzing with anticipation. The air hummed with the weight of unsaid things, the kind of tension that makes the smallest gestures feel amplified. When Jeremiah's name was called, he rose from his seat, his legs trembling beneath him. As he approached the podium, he glanced at the audience. He saw the skepticism in some faces, the indifference in others, but he also saw something else, a flicker of curiosity, of possibility. Jeremiah opened his notebook and began to read. His voice was steady, each word a small rebellion against the weight of expectation. He spoke of dreams deferred, of invisible boundaries, and of the quiet resilience that had carried him to this moment. As he spoke, the room began to shift. Some leaned forward, their expressions softening. Others crossed their arms tighter, their discomfort palpable. By the time he finished, the applause was scattered but genuine. Jeremiah stepped away from the podium, his heart racing. He had done it, not perfectly, not without doubt, but he had done it. And as he looked out at the audience one last time, he realized something important. This was only the beginning. The applause faded as Jeremiah stepped down from the podium, his heart still thundering in his chest. The room felt both larger and smaller now, a sea of faces that he had somehow crossed. Some offered polite nods, others clapped slowly, their expressions inscrutable. In the back, he spotted Henry, leaning against the wall with a faint smile, his arms crossed. It wasn't a triumph, not yet, but it wasn't a failure either. As Jeremiah made his way toward the exit, a white man in a pressed suit intercepted him. His salt and pepper hair was combed neatly back, and his smile was just a shade too wide. "Mr. Whitaker," the man said, extending a hand, "I'm Thomas Beauregard, one of the sponsors of tonight's event. You have a way with words, son." Jeremiah hesitated, then shook his hand, feeling the weight of the man's grip linger a beat too long. "Thank you," he replied cautiously. Thomas gestured toward a small group gathered near the refreshments table. "Come join us," he said. "We'd love to hear more about your work." Jeremiah glanced at Henry, who gave him a subtle nod, then followed Thomas across the room. The group was a mix of writers, local officials, and a few well-dressed spectators who looked as if they had wandered in by accident. Their conversations were polite, their smiles practiced, but the undertone was clear. Jeremiah was under scrutiny. One of the women, wearing pearls that caught the light whenever she turned her head, leaned in closer. "Your speech was very poignant," she said, the pause before the word hanging in the air. "But don't you think some of the things you said were a bit harsh? After all, we've come a long way, haven't we?" Jeremiah felt his chest tighten. He glanced around the circle, reading the faces. Some nodded, others avoided his gaze. The air grew heavier, the question daring him to temper his truth. "I appreciate that perspective," he began carefully, "but progress isn't the same for everyone. Some roads are still harder to travel." Another man, younger and with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned, chuckled. "Surely, though, things aren't as bad as they used to be. I mean, look at you. Here you are, standing on this stage, being celebrated. That's progress, isn't it?" Jeremiah's grip tightened around the glass in his hand. He thought of Elsie, of Mrs. Harris, of the small diner that had been both a refuge and a reminder of limitations. He thought of the way Mr. Granger had looked past him, of the subtle slights and outright barriers that had shaped his life. "It's a start," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But being allowed in the room doesn't mean the room belongs to me. Or that it ever truly will." The group fell silent, some exchanging uncomfortable glances. Thomas cleared his throat, forcing a smile. "Well, that's certainly food for thought," he said, clapping Jeremiah on the shoulder. "You've given us a lot to chew on." Later, Jeremiah found himself alone near the exit, the hum of conversation fading into background noise. Henry joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "You handled yourself well," he said, his tone low. "They weren't ready to hear it," Jeremiah replied, his voice weary. "Maybe they never will be." Henry shrugged. "Doesn't matter if they're ready. What matters is that you said it. Jeremiah nodded, though the weight of the evening pressed harder against him. Just then, a young black woman approached, her dark curls framing a face filled with quiet determination. She carried a notebook under one arm, and her hands trembled slightly as she extended one to him. "Mr. Whitaker," she said softly, "your words meant a lot tonight. I've been trying to write my own story, but it's hard to find the courage. Hearing you speak, it reminded me that I had to keep trying." Jeremiah looked at her, the tightness in his chest easing just a little. "What's your name?" he asked. "Camille," she replied. "Well, Camille," he said, "keep writing. The hardest part isn't putting the words on paper. It's believing they deserve to be read." She smiled, her grip on her notebook tightening as if it were a lifeline. "Thank you," she said before disappearing into the crowd. By the time Jeremiah and Henry left the event, the streets of Greenville were quiet. The air was cooler now, the sharp edges of the day softening into the calm of night. As they walked, Henry spoke. "You made an impact tonight. You know, on a few people," Jeremiah replied, "but for every Camille, there are a dozen who'd rather I stay quiet." Henry stopped, turning to face him. "Maybe," he said, "but change doesn't start with a crowd. It starts with one person willing to speak up. You did that tonight. Don't lose sight of it." Jeremiah looked up at the darkened windows of the city around them, the weight of the room still heavy on his shoulders. He thought of his small town, of the diner, of the quiet moments where resilience had been forged in the fire of silence. "Maybe you're right," he said finally, "but it's going to take more than words." Henry smiled, clapping him on the back. "Good thing you've got plenty of those." As they continued down the street, the faint glow of streetlights illuminated their path. Jeremiah knew the road ahead would be long, filled with resistance and uncertainty. But for the first time in a while, he felt ready to keep walking. The following weeks brought a strange rhythm to Jeremiah's life. Invitations to speak began to trickle in from other towns and small gatherings. Each time he stood behind a podium, the faces before him ranged from expectant to skeptical. His words seemed to bloom in the air, fragile and fleeting, met with moments of nodding approval or stone-cold indifference. He had always understood that change was slow, but now he was learning how painfully so. Yet, not every reaction was quiet. It happened one evening in Wilmington, where Jeremiah was invited to speak at a community hall. The room was packed tighter than usual, the folding chairs filled to capacity. Some had come to listen, others to judge. As Jeremiah spoke about the weight of unseen boundaries, a voice interrupted him from the back of the room. "Why don't you just let it go?" the man said, his tone sharp and mocking. He stood tall, a white factory worker with grease-streaked hands folded across his chest. "You keep talking like we're all against you. But maybe the problem with you." The room bristled. Jeremiah paused, his heartbeat quickening as murmurs rippled through the crowd. He took a steadying breath and looked directly at the man. "I'm not here to divide us," he said evenly. "I'm here to point out the cracks in the foundation. We can't fix a house if we pretend the damage isn't there." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "And who gets to decide what's broken? You?" A murmur of agreement rippled through a few in the crowd. Emboldened by the confrontation, Jeremiah met their stares, his voice steady but firm. "It's not about me deciding. It's about all of us looking at what's right in front of us." For a moment, silence filled the hall, heavy and taut. Then, a woman in the front row, a black teacher named Mrs. Vaughn, whom Jeremiah had spoken with before the event, stood up. Her voice was quiet but resolute. "I've spent years trying to teach my students that they matter, no matter where they come from or what they look like. But every day, the world tells them something different. That's not something you can just let go." The man opened his mouth to reply, but the room's energy had shifted. Others began to speak, their voices blending into a chorus of lived experiences. Jeremiah watched as the conversation moved beyond him, as though he had merely set the spark. Later, as Jeremiah packed his notes and prepared to leave, Mrs. Vaughn approached him. "You've stirred something," she said, "but stirring the pot doesn't always mean the soup's ready to serve." Jeremiah smiled faintly. "I've never been much of a cook," he replied, "but I figure it's better to keep stirring than to let it burn." The confrontation in Wilmington was a turning point, but it came with a cost. Jeremiah noticed the subtle changes in the weeks that followed. The mail that arrived at his small apartment included more than just event invitations now. There were unsigned letters, some praising him, others laced with thinly veiled threats. One morning, as he left his apartment to meet Henry at the diner, he found the word troublemaker scrawled in chalk on the sidewalk in front of his door. He paused, staring at the crude lettering. It wasn't the first time he'd seen such a message, and it wouldn't be the last, but each one carried the sting of a truth he could never quite escape. Henry arrived moments later, his brow furrowing as he saw the words. "You okay?" he asked. Jeremiah nodded, though his chest felt tight. "It's just chalk," he said. "It'll wash away." Henry studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Maybe, but the people who put it there? They're not going anywhere." That afternoon, Jeremiah met with Elsie at the diner. She had heard about Wilmington, about the man who had challenged him, and about the growing attention his words were drawing. "You've got to be careful," she said, her voice low but urgent. "The more noise you make, the more you'll attract people who don't want to hear it." Jeremiah stirred his coffee, watching the dark liquid swirl. "If I stop now, what does that say to the ones who need to hear it?" Elsie reached across the table, resting a hand on his. "Just don't forget, Jeremiah, the ones who fight hardest against you. They're not just afraid of change. They're afraid of losing something they think is theirs." Her words stayed with him as he walked home that evening, the shadows stretching long across the pavement. He knew she was right. The pushback wasn't just resistance, it was fear. And fear, he had learned, was the most dangerous kind of enemy. By the time Jeremiah reached his apartment, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the street in muted twilight. As he climbed the stairs, he noticed an envelope wedged under his door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Keep your head down, Whitaker. Some things aren't worth the fight." Jeremiah stared at the note, his pulse quickening. The words were calm, almost polite, but the intent was clear. Someone wanted him to stop, and they wanted him to know they were watching. He folded the note and placed it in his pocket. The room around him felt smaller, quieter, heavier. Sitting at his desk, he opened his notebook, the blank page staring back at him. For a long moment, he considered leaving it empty. What if they were right? What if some fights aren't worth it? But then he thought of Mrs. Vaughn, of Elsie, of Camille, and of the faces he had seen in Wilmington. He thought of the cracks in the foundation, the silence that had pressed on his family for generations, and the voices that had been lost because no one had spoken up. Jeremiah picked up his pen and began to write. In the weeks that followed, Jeremiah found himself walking a tightrope between two worlds. The hopeful faces who saw him as a voice of truth and the shadowy whispers that trailed him, threatening to drown that voice out. Each day brought new opportunities and new challenges. His speech in Wilmington had drawn more attention than he anticipated. Invitations to speak at churches, community centers, and even local colleges arrived almost daily. Jeremiah should have felt triumphant. Yet the weight of the growing opposition pressed heavily on him. Resistance wasn't just loud voices in a crowd anymore. It was subtle, insidious, and relentless. The meeting in the church basement. One evening, Jeremiah was invited to speak at a small church in a neighboring town. The event was modest, held in the basement, with folding chairs arranged in neat rows. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old hymnals, and the crowd was smaller than he'd grown used to. Mostly older black men and women, their faces lined with decades of struggle and perseverance. Jeremiah spoke about dignity, about the power of ordinary people to shape extraordinary change. His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. But as he finished, a man in the back of the room stood up. "Brother Whitaker," the man said, his voice deep and weary. "You speak of change, but change has a way of turning on you. I've seen it happen before. Folks get inspired, they speak out, and then they're silenced. What makes you think this time will be any different?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Jeremiah. He felt the weight of the question pressing down on him, the unspoken fear behind it. What if the cost is too high? Jeremiah looked at the man, his voice steady but soft. "I can't promise it'll be different," he said, "but I can promise that silence won't save us. The cracks we ignore today will only grow wider tomorrow." The man studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Just be careful, son," he said as he sat down. "The road you're on? It's not an easy one." The call in the night. Later that night, as Jeremiah lay in bed, the phone rang. He hesitated before answering. Calls this late rarely brought good news. "Whitaker?" a man's voice said on the other end, low and unfamiliar. Yes, Jeremiah replied, gripping the receiver tightly. You've been making a lot of noise lately. Some folks don't like that. Jeremiah's throat tightened, but he forced his voice to remain calm. Who is this? Just someone who thinks you should keep your opinions to yourself. The voice said. There was a pause, and then the man added, you've got people who care about you, right? Think about them. The line went dead. Jeremiah sat in the darkness, the receiver still pressed to his ear. He had expected resistance, but this was different. This was personal. Camille's concern. The next morning, Jeremiah shared the call with his sister Camille as they sat at her kitchen table. She listened quietly, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her brow furrowed in concern. You need to stop, Jeremiah, she said finally, her voice trembling. This isn't just about you anymore. These people, they don't play fair. Jeremiah shook his head. I can't stop now. Camille, you've seen what's happening. If I back down, what does that say to everyone who's counting on me? Camille's eyes filled with tears. It says you're human. It says you value your life. Jeremiah reached across the table, taking her hand. I do value my life. That's why I'm doing this. Because a life lived in fear isn't a life at all. Camille said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. She wasn't convinced, and Jeremiah couldn't blame her. The businessman's offer. A week later, Jeremiah was approached by a man who introduced himself as Harold Bennett. A local businessman with a polished suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. They met at a diner after one of Jeremiah's speeches. At Bennett's request. You're a passionate man, Mr. Whitaker, Bennett said, stirring his coffee. But passion can be dangerous. It makes enemies. Jeremiah raised an eyebrow. And what exactly are you trying to say? Bennett leaned forward, his voice dropping. I'm saying you're a smart man. You got away with words. Why waste that on a fight you can't win? Jeremiah's jaw tightened. I'm not looking to win. I'm looking for justice. Bennett smirked. Justice doesn't pay the bills, Mr. Whitaker. But if you're willing to walk away, I can make it worth your while. A little money, a little stability. You could start over, somewhere quiet. Jeremiah stared at him, a cold anger rising in his chest. You think you can buy my silence? I think everyone has their price, Bennett said smoothly. Jeremiah stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Not me, he said. You tell whoever sent you that I'm not for sale. Bennett's smile faltered. Careful, Mr. Whitaker, he said as Jeremiah walked away. Pride can be a dangerous thing. The neighborhood incident. That same night, as Jeremiah returned home, he noticed a group of teenagers lingering near his building. Their voices were loud, their laughter sharp and mocking. One of them held a can of spray paint, and as Jeremiah approached, he saw the fresh graffiti scrawled across the wall. Know your place. Jeremiah's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to confront them, to demand answers, but he knew it wouldn't help. Instead, he stood there in the cold, staring at the words, their meaning cutting deeper than he cared to admit. The teenagers noticed him and scattered, their laughter echoing down the street. Jeremiah stayed for a moment longer, then went inside. His resolve hardened. They wanted him to back down. They wanted him to feel small. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. A turning point. The next day, Jeremiah met with Henry and Elsie to plan their next steps. He told them about the call, the offer, the graffiti. This is getting dangerous, Henry said, his voice low. You need to think about whether this is worth it. Jeremiah looked at him, his expression unwavering. It's not just worth it, Henry. It's necessary. Elsie placed a hand on his shoulder. Then we stand with you, she said. But don't forget, you're not alone in this. Jeremiah nodded, gratitude swelling in his chest. For all the threats and challenges, he had people who believed in him. People who understood that the fight wasn't just his. It was theirs. As they left the diner, Jeremiah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was treacherous, but he was ready. The whispers of fear and doubt might follow him, but they would never define him. The fight was far from over. In many ways, it was only the beginning. The wind carried a biting chill that evening as Jeremiah stood outside the community center, staring at the modest sign above the entrance. His name was etched in small letters beneath the center's title, a gesture of gratitude from those he had inspired. But tonight, it felt like a target. He had spent the past few weeks weaving his message into the fabric of the community, igniting hope, but also angering forces determined to silence him. A gathering storm. The threats had grown bolder. Graffiti turned into slashed tires. Anonymous phone calls became ominous letters shoved under his door. One morning, a brick crashed through the window of the community center, landing in the middle of the space where children gathered for tutoring sessions. Attached to it was a note: "Keep talking, and it won't just be glass." Jeremiah stared at the broken glass on the floor. His reflection fragmented and distorted. He could feel the tension building in his chest. This wasn't just resistance, it was war. He called the police, but the response was as cold as the winter wind. The officer taking the report barely concealed his disinterest, dismissing the incident as "kids looking for trouble." "Kids don't write notes like that," Jeremiah muttered under his breath. The officer glanced up, irritation flickering in his eyes. "Do yourself a favor, Mr. Whitaker. Stay out of trouble, and trouble will stay out of your way." Jeremiah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The words stung not because they were dismissive, but because they reflected an attitude he had seen his entire life. A casual disregard for lives that didn't fit neatly into the officer's worldview. Camille's breaking point. Camille visited him that evening, her face drawn with worry. She placed a casserole dish on his counter, her way of showing support when words failed her. "You need to stop, Jeremiah," she said finally, her voice trembling. "This is getting out of hand." "I can't stop now," he replied, his tone resolute. "They want me to stop because they know the truth scares them." "And what about me?" Camille snapped, her voice breaking. "What about the people who love you? Every time my phone rings, I'm terrified it's someone telling me you're—" She stopped, unable to finish the thought. Jeremiah walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'm doing this for us, Camille. For you. For our parents. For everyone who came before us and everyone who's coming after. If I stop, what does that say to them?" Camille shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. "It says you value your life." Jeremiah didn't respond. He couldn't. The truth was, he didn't know how much more he could endure. But he wasn't ready to give up. A night of reckoning. 2 nights later, Jeremiah was returning home from a late meeting with Henry and Elsie. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that hummed with unease. As he rounded a corner, he noticed 2 men leaning against a car, their eyes tracking him as he walked by. Their whispered exchange prickled the back of his neck, but he kept moving, his pace steady and deliberate. When he reached his apartment, he found the door slightly ajar. He froze, every instinct screaming at him to back away. But curiosity, or stubbornness, propelled him forward. Inside, the place was ransacked. Papers littered the floor, drawers hung open, and his bookshelf was toppled. On the wall, written in bold red paint, were the words, "This is your last warning." Jeremiah stood there, his breathing shallow. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to scare him. They were sending a message. He clenched his fists, the rage simmering beneath his skin threatening to boil over. He called the police again. And again. They responded with indifference. "We'll look into it," the officer said, his tone suggesting otherwise. After they left, Henry showed up, his face dark with concern. "This isn't random, Jeremiah. They're trying to break you." "I know," Jeremiah said, his voice steady, "but they don't understand. I've already been broken. You can't break someone who's used to piecing themselves back together." An unexpected ally. The next day, Jeremiah received an unexpected call from Reverend Hayes, a prominent figure in the black church community. The Reverend's deep, steady voice carried both wisdom and urgency. "I've been hearing about what you're doing, Brother Whitaker," Hayes said. "You've got courage, but courage alone won't protect you. Meet me tonight." That evening, Jeremiah arrived at the Reverend's office, a modest room filled with books and photographs chronicling decades of activism. Hayes was seated behind his desk, his eyes piercing yet kind. "They're coming after you because you're shaking the foundations of a system built to keep us quiet," Hayes said, "but you don't have to fight this alone." Hayes explained that he had connections, activists, lawyers, and even sympathetic journalists, who could help amplify Jeremiah's message and shield him from the worst of the backlash. "But you need to understand," Hayes added, "this isn't just a fight for land or laws. It's a fight for hearts and minds. And those battles take a toll." Jeremiah nodded. "I've felt the toll, Reverend, but I'm not ready to stop." Hayes leaned back, studying him. "Then we'll stand with you." A fire in the night. 2 days later, Jeremiah's resolve was tested once more. In the dead of night, the community center was set ablaze. By the time the fire department arrived, the damage was done. The flames had devoured the roof and left the walls charred, the smell of smoke lingering in the air long after the fire was extinguished. Jeremiah stood in the rubble the next morning, the ash staining his shoes. Around him, community members gathered, their faces etched with anger and despair. "They can burn the building," Jeremiah said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "But they can't burn what it stands for." The crowd murmured in agreement, their anger hardening into determination. It was in that moment that Jeremiah realized the truth. The fight wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to all of them. A call to action. That evening, Jeremiah and Reverend Hayes organized a rally in the park. People of all ages and backgrounds gathered, their faces illuminated by candles as the sun set. Jeremiah spoke with a fervor he hadn't known he possessed, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This isn't about one man or one building," he said. "It's about a system that tells us we're less than, that we don't belong. It's about fighting for a world where our children can grow up without fear." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing into the night. As Jeremiah looked out at the sea of faces, he felt a spark of hope. The threats and violence had been meant to silence him, but instead, they had lit a fire that couldn't be extinguished. The battle was far from over. But Jeremiah knew one thing for certain: he wasn't fighting alone anymore. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would endure. The morning sun spilled weakly through gray clouds as Jeremiah Whitaker stood at the edge of the courthouse steps. Flanked by Reverend Hayes and a small group of supporters, the rally had drawn attention. Newspapers, television crews, even whispers of a documentary. The community was rallying behind him. But as the stakes rose, so did the forces aligned against him. A subtle war. The opposition's tactics were no longer confined to midnight threats or acts of vandalism. It became evident in whispers that spread like poison, in anonymous op-eds questioning Jeremiah's credibility, and in the quiet withdrawal of local businesses from their pledges of support. "People are scared," Camille said, handing Jeremiah a stack of letters left at the community center's makeshift office. Some were words of encouragement, others thinly veiled warnings. "They think standing with you will cost them everything." Jeremiah nodded, the weight of their fear heavy on his shoulders. He couldn't blame them, he knew what it felt like to carry the burden of uncertainty. But it was the quiet betrayals that cut deepest. Longtime allies began distancing themselves, their excuses framed with sympathetic smiles and words of regret. Even Henry, his steadfast confidant, grew more irritable, the strain of the fight etching deep lines on his face. "You can't save everyone, Jeremiah," Henry muttered one evening, staring out at the empty streets. "Sometimes, you just survive. That's the fight." Jeremiah looked at him, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "Surviving isn't enough, Henry. Not anymore." A case unraveling. The legal battle over the land had reached a fever pitch. The developers, emboldened by wealth and influence, escalated their efforts to discredit Jeremiah. Their lawyers combed through every facet of his life, dredging up anything they could use to undermine him. One afternoon, Camille stormed into the office, her face flushed with anger. "They're saying you forged documents, Jeremiah, that you're fabricating this whole story." "I expected that," Jeremiah said, his voice calm but his hands trembling slightly. "It's what they do when they're desperate." Camille slammed a newspaper onto the desk, the headline blaring. "Activists claims face scrutiny as evidence emerges of fraud." "They're calling you a liar," she said, her voice cracking. "How do you fight that?" Jeremiah picked up the paper, staring at the words until they blurred. "By telling the truth, over and over again, until they can't ignore it." The fractures deepen. The strain began to show in the courtroom as well. Reverend Hayes' legal team, though skilled, struggled to keep pace with the opposition's endless motions and delays. Each small victory for Jeremiah felt undercut by new hurdles. And yet, the courtroom was packed daily with supporters, their presence a silent testament to the stakes of his fight. One day, during a particularly grueling cross-examination, the opposing lawyer smirked as he laid out his case. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "wouldn't it be easier to let this go? The land is being developed into something the community can use. Jobs, housing, economic growth. Surely you can see the greater good here." Jeremiah's gaze didn't waver. "The greater good?" he said, his voice low but firm. When you take something that doesn't belong to you, it doesn't matter how pretty you dress it up. It's still theft. The lawyer leaned in. But isn't it true, Mr. Whitaker, that you lost this land because you couldn't pay your taxes? That the county followed the law? Jeremiah hesitated, the weight of the truth heavy on his chest. I lost it because the system is designed for people like me to fail. He said finally, and you know that as well as I do. A devastating blow. That night, Jeremiah returned to find his apartment ransacked again. But this time, something was missing, his only copy of the deed that tied him to the land. Panic clawed at him as he searched the wreckage. But the folder he had tucked so carefully into a drawer was gone. They're trying to erase you, Reverend Hayes said when Jeremiah called him, his voice a mix of anger and resolve. But they can't erase the truth. Jeremiah sank into a chair, his hands shaking. It feels like they already have. Without that deed, Hayes interrupted, you're still here, and so is the community that believes in you. Don't let them win, Jeremiah. A dangerous turning point. The weeks dragged on, each day a struggle to maintain hope. Then, one morning, Jeremiah awoke to find a black SUV idling outside his apartment building. He watched as two men in suits stepped out, their eyes scanning the street before they approached his door. He opened it before they could knock, his heart pounding in his chest. Mr. Whitaker, one of them said, his tone flat, we need to talk. Jeremiah stood his ground. If you've got something to say it here. The man exchanged a glance with his companion before pulling out an envelope. A settlement offer, he said, handing it over. Take the money, drop the case, and this all goes away. Jeremiah stared at the envelope, the weight of its implications pressing down on him. He didn't need to open it to know what it contained. Hush money. A final attempt to buy his silence. He tore the envelope in half. Tell your bosses I'm not for sale. A spark rekindled. The following Sunday, Reverend Hayes led a service at the burned-out community center. The congregation gathering amidst the rubble. Jeremiah sat in the front row, his spirit battered but unbroken. Hayes' voice carried over the crowd, each word a lifeline. We are standing on hallowed ground, he said, not because of what it was, but because of what it will be. This fight isn't about a man or a piece of land. It's about the soul of a nation. The congregation erupted into applause, their voices rising in a hymn that echoed through the broken walls. Jeremiah felt a tear slip down his cheek as the music swelled. The fight wasn't over, but he wasn't fighting alone. As the service ended, Camille approached, her eyes shining with determination. They can tear down buildings, Jeremiah, she said, but they can't tear down what you've built in people's hearts. For the first time in weeks, Jeremiah allowed himself a small smile. Then we give them something they can't tear down. With the community behind him, Jeremiah prepared for the battles ahead, knowing the road was long and the stakes were high. But as he looked out at the faces of those who believed in him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. The courtroom was overflowing, the air buzzed with anticipation, an almost electric tension that seemed to vibrate through the walls. This was not just a legal battle. It had become a national symbol. Supporters filled every available seat, their faces marked by years of struggle and hope. The community had rallied, their voices loud and unwavering. But the opposition was equally fierce, their wealth and influence casting long shadows over the proceedings. The turning tide. Jeremiah Whitaker sat at the defendant's table, flanked by Reverend Hayes and Camille. Across from him, the developer's legal team whispered among themselves, their expressions tight. They had underestimated him. He had refused their bribes, withstood their threats, and turned every act of intimidation into fuel for his fight. Elizabeth, his lawyer, rose to address the court. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm yet commanding. We are here not only to determine ownership of a piece of land but to confront a system that exploits the vulnerable. This case is about more than one man. It is about justice. The opposition lawyer stood, his tone clipped. This case is about property law. Your Honor, nothing more. Mr. Whitaker has failed to provide verifiable evidence of his claims. The judge, a stern man with deep-set eyes, leaned forward. Ms. Hayes, continue. Elizabeth nodded. Your Honor, I would like to call our final witness to the stand. The room stilled as an older black man walked slowly toward the witness stand. His presence was quiet but powerful. It was Mr. Albert Graham. a retired county clerk who had worked in the records office for over 40 years. "Mr. Graham," Elizabeth began, "you were employed at the county records office during the time of the auction in question?" "Yes, ma'am," he said, his voice steady. "And can you tell the court what you observed regarding the handling of Mr. Whitaker's property records?" Mr. Graham took a deep breath, his hands gripping the edge of the stand. "I saw irregularities, records that didn't match, dates that had been altered. I raised concerns, but they were dismissed." The opposing lawyer immediately objected. "Hearsay, Your Honor." Elizabeth turned sharply. "Your Honor, we have corroborating documents to support Mr. Graham's testimony." The judge motioned for her to continue, and Elizabeth presented a series of emails and memos from the records office, showing clear evidence of tampering. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the judge's gavel cutting through the noise. The final blow. As the evidence mounted, the developer's case began to crumble. Their lawyers argued fervently, but it was clear they were on the defensive. Then came the testimony that turned the tide for good. A whistleblower from within the development company, Natalie Harper, a former employee, had been reluctant to come forward. But after weeks of reflection, she took the stand. Her words cut through the courtroom like a knife. "They knew the land was his," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "They knew it, and they manipulated the auction to take it. They bribed county officials, forged documents, and destroyed evidence." The developer's lawyers tried to discredit her, but the weight of her testimony, combined with the documents she provided, was undeniable. The courtroom was silent as she finished speaking, her words hanging in the air like a challenge to everyone present. The verdict. When the judge finally delivered his decision, the room was so quiet that Jeremiah could hear his own heartbeat. The judge's voice was firm, his words clear. "This court finds that the auction was conducted unlawfully, with evidence of tampering, bribery, and bad faith practices. Ownership of the property is hereby restored to Mr. Jeremiah Whitaker." The room erupted in cheers, but the judge's gavel quickly silenced them. "Furthermore," he continued, "I am recommending a federal investigation into the actions of the development company and the county officials involved in this case." Jeremiah sat in stunned silence, the weight of the moment overwhelming. Reverend Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder, his smile wide and unguarded. Camille was crying, her tears a mix of relief and triumph. Aftermath. In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the case was seismic. The developers faced lawsuits and federal investigations. County officials resigned in disgrace. The community rallied to help Jeremiah rebuild the land, not just for himself but for everyone. Under the old oak tree that had stood witness to so much, Jeremiah announced his plans. The land would become a community space, a sanctuary for those who had been displaced or forgotten. It would be a testament to resilience and the power of collective action. People came from all over to help. Volunteers built a community center, planted gardens, and erected a plaque under the oak tree that read, "This land stands as a symbol of justice." A reminder that hope and perseverance can prevail. A quiet victory. One evening, as the sun set over the land, Jeremiah sat beneath the oak tree, watching children play in the newly built park. Henry sat beside him, a grin on his face. "They never saw you coming. You know," Henry said. Jeremiah chuckled. "They didn't see us coming." In the distance, the faint sound of a gospel choir rose from the community center, their voices lifting into the twilight. Jeremiah closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He had fought, not just for himself but for a better world. And in that fight, he had found something greater. A community bound together by hope and a shared belief in justice. As the stars began to appear, Jeremiah leaned back against the tree, a small smile playing on his lips. The fight wasn't over. There was always more to do. But tonight, under the vast expanse of the sky, he allowed himself a moment to breathe, to rest, and to dream of what could come next.